The Widow's Trade, Part 1. Shadows of the Past. Eleanor Vance had once lived a life draped in satin and silver. The sweeping estate of Aldercrest Manor had been her kingdom, and her husband, Jonathan Vance, the powerful king of a shipping empire that touched 5 continents. She was once known in the society pages as the Velvet Widow, though she was not yet a widow then because of the elegance with which she carried herself and the shadows that always seemed to follow her. But by the autumn of 2008, after the financial crisis cracked open the gilded masks of the elite, Eleanor's life had come undone. The global crash devoured fortunes like wildfire, and her husband's was among the first to vanish. Or so it appeared. Jonathan had been found dead in his office at Vance Maritime Holdings, a sleek skyscraper built to resemble the prow of a ship slicing through the Manhattan skyline. The coroner had ruled it a heart attack, natural causes, stress from the markets. That was the official story. But Eleanor never believed in official stories. The funeral was a grand affair, befitting the legacy Jonathan had built. White orchids blanketed the cathedral. Eulogies flowed like wine. People whispered about the tragedy of it all, how Jonathan had been in the prime of his life, how Eleanor now stood alone at 42 with no children, how the empire he built had crumbled beneath her feet. What they didn't whisper was the truth. 3 weeks after the funeral, Eleanor received a package wrapped in oil-stained brown paper. No return address. Inside, a worn leather notebook that smelled of salt and tobacco. It was Jonathan's journal, though not the one kept in his study at Aldercrest, the one journalists occasionally quoted. This was different. It was filled with entries in a code she recognized instantly. Jonathan had taught it to her once, long ago, back when love was new and trust was pure. A substitution cipher from their college days. Hidden within those pages was something far more dangerous than poetry or memories. It was a ledger. A list of offshore accounts, secret shipments, bribed officials, and most damningly, a series of payments to a private bank in the Cayman Islands, dated just days before his heart attack. And then, at the very bottom of the final page, if anything happens to me, it wasn't natural. Start with Hawthorne. Eleanor stared at the name. Her fingers trembled, not with fear, but with clarity. Thomas Hawthorne had been Jonathan's longtime partner, his shadow, some called him. The man never smiled, unless it was over a negotiation table. Cold, precise, and now, possibly, a murderer. Eleanor put the journal into the fireplace that night, but she didn't burn it. Instead, she stared into the flames and whispered to the darkness, "You made me a widow. Now I'll make myself your reckoning." 2 years later, Geneva, Switzerland. The woman seated at the Baccarat crystal bar of the Hotel de la Paix was no longer the same Eleanor Vance. She was now Elise Van Doorn, a Dutch-born commodities trader with a reputation for ruthless deals and a taste for Dom Perignon. Her auburn hair was cropped short in a style that made her look both glamorous and dangerous. No one in this world knew of Aldercrest Manor. No one here had heard of Jonathan Vance. But the man across the room had Thomas Hawthorne. He was older now, but not diminished. If anything, his aura had grown more formidable. He had survived the crash, reinvented himself in the shadows, and now sat atop a network of front companies stretching from Liechtenstein to Singapore. He believed Eleanor was dead, or at least irrelevant, and that was her greatest weapon. As Elise, Eleanor had spent the last 2 years infiltrating the underworld of global finance, earning trust, making trades, and collecting secrets. She had studied everything. Hawthorne's shell corporations, his mistresses, his middlemen, even the obscure law firm in Dubai that handled his dark paperwork. She was no longer just a widow. She was a ghost wrapped in velvet and vengeance. That night in Geneva was not by chance. It was the first movement in a long game. Eleanor approached his table like a panther in stilettos. Her voice, when she introduced herself, was light, touched with a Dutch accent she'd practiced for months. "I hear you're looking for someone to handle discreet commodity movements through the Baltic," she said with a sly smile. Hawthorne looked up, intrigued. "And who told you that?" "Friends," she said, swirling her glass. "The kind who know how to listen and forget." He studied her, then motioned to the seat beside him. "Tell me, Miss Van Doorn, "Do you believe in loyalty?" She smiled. "I believe in leverage." The next 6 months were a blur of jet fuel, contracts, and increasingly dangerous deals. Eleanor, as Elise, became a trusted associate. Hawthorne brought her closer, unknowingly inviting the blade into his ribs. She didn't rush. She gathered evidence, slowly, meticulously. Emails, voice memos, photos of meetings that should never have existed. She recruited a small team, ex-CIA analysts, a disgraced banker from Seoul, and a Turkish hacker named Layla, each with their own vendetta and price. They worked in silence. One thread at a time, they began to unravel Hawthorne's empire. But there was one thing Eleanor hadn't anticipated: emotion. Late one evening in a Lisbon safe house, while reviewing surveillance footage of a transaction in Marrakesh, Eleanor found herself alone with Layla. "You really think this will bring him down?" Layla asked, tapping ash into a carved onyx tray. "People like him have 9 lives, 10 lawyers, and 0 conscience." Eleanor looked out the window, the lights of the harbor reflecting in her eyes like shattered gold. "I'm not trying to bring him down," she whispered. "I'm trying to make him bleed." Layla paused, then asked, "And after that?" Eleanor said nothing, because she didn't know. To understand Eleanor's fury, one must understand the rot at the heart of her marriage. Jonathan Vance had once been a man of vision, a builder, a dreamer. But dreams decay when fed with greed. Near the end, he had changed. Paranoid, secretive, cruel. He beat their dog once. Then he started locking his office at night. Then came the whispers of affairs, of payoffs to keep quiet the screams of exploited dock workers in South Asia. Eleanor had tried to confront him. Once, he had slapped her. Not hard, but enough. Enough to change everything. She had packed her bags that night, driven away into the storm. But the next morning, he had appeared at her family home in Rhode Island, soaked to the bone, crying in the rain. She forgave him. And then, he died. Or was killed. That memory haunted her how close she'd come to walking away. How she might have been free had she not believed his final tears. She would not make that mistake again. In Paris, at a gala under the chandeliers of the Palais Garnier, Eleanor received a warning. An envelope slid beneath her hotel room door. No return address. Inside, a single sentence typed on hotel stationery. "You are not the only ghost hunting Hawthorne." She stared at it for a long time. It was a message, a threat, or perhaps an invitation. There were others. Other victims? Other enemies? She traced the watermark on the paper. It matched the hotel stationery, a clue carelessly or intentionally left. She traced the source through surveillance and tips until it led to a name: Marco Silvestri, an Italian fixer, once Hawthorne's enforcer, now vanished, presumed dead. But Eleanor found him, living in the shadows of Naples, disfigured from a car bomb meant for him. He told her everything: how Hawthorne orchestrated Jonathan's death with the help of a Colombian broker named Ruiz, how the Cayman transfers were not to protect wealth but to buy silence. Hawthorne had feared Jonathan might turn on him, so he struck first. "He drinks red wine from Tuscany," Marco rasped, "but his soul tastes like ash." Eleanor paid him in diamonds. He asked only one thing in return: make it hurt. Julian Marlowe once believed that money was the most powerful force in the world. He now knew better. Money could buy silence, yes, but only for a time. It could buy access, open doors, smooth over legal hurdles, even sway elections. But it could not revive the dead, nor permanently erase the stink of betrayal. And certainly, it could not quiet the guilt that bloomed like rot inside the mind of a grieving husband. When Julian returned to New York from the Cayman Islands, it wasn't just with forged accounts and hidden assets. He came back with a name: Maxim Varga. The name was thin at first, a whisper in a sea of corporate shell games and digital shadows. But Julian followed the whisper through shipping manifests, company registries in Montenegro, a South African holding company, and finally a yacht charter business in Marseille. Varga wasn't a ghost. He was a man of flesh and blood. He dined in Monaco, rubbed shoulders with princes and oil barons, and lived like a demigod above the law. Julian smiled. Flesh and blood meant something tangible, something that could bleed. Julian returned to New York and activated the second phase of his plan. He began liquidating certain public assets at a loss, triggering alarms in financial media. He leaked fake board memos implying Marlowe Equity was in trouble. He knew Varga's people would see the weakness and act. They did. A hostile takeover bid emerged within a week from a shell company that Julian's team traced directly to one of Varga's proxies. But what Varga didn't know was that the proxy firm had already been compromised. Julian let the bid proceed. He allowed them to gain controlling interest in Marlowe Equity. He staged a public defeat. But embedded in the company's digital framework was a series of tripwire contracts, each one connected to dormant legal clauses, offshore triggers, and strategic debt liabilities. When activated, the contracts would expose Varga's entire network of shell companies to international regulators. All Julian had to do was wait. As the legal dominoes began to fall, Julian retreated into anonymity. He let the chaos unfurl like a slow, choking fire. Varga's companies were hit with audits. Several countries opened investigations. Swiss banks froze accounts. Private mercenaries disappeared. Some assets vanished entirely. Varga responded with silence. And then, the photo arrived. It was sent to Julian's private line. Claire's face, smiling, but altered slightly wrong. Her eyes were too bright, her jawline too sharp. AI generated. A warning. Julian stood at the edge of his penthouse balcony that night and whispered, "You don't scare me." But he was lying. One by one, the members of the widow's trade began to vanish. Noor was found in her apartment, overdosed. Charles disappeared from a train between Prague and Vienna. The team was being hunted. Julian had prepared for this. He went underground, burned identities, activated contingency plans. He met with a contact in Istanbul, someone who knew the final piece of Varga's empire, Project Ashfall, a system designed to destabilize a nation's currency through a synchronized media campaign, data sabotage, and digital bank runs. Varga planned to test it in Malaysia, a beta run for a larger target, the euro. Julian knew he had to act before the system launched. He couldn't fight Varga's reach, but he could destroy the blueprint. By the time Margaret returned to Hong Kong, the skyline had changed. Skyscrapers now dwarfed the buildings she had once known. The old markets she used to pass by were replaced by sterile shopping malls. Yet, some things remained unchanged, like the humidity that hung over the harbor and the smell of diesel and salt lingering in the air. She arrived not as the grieving widow of a shipping magnate, but as a figure cloaked in anonymity. Her name was no longer whispered in yacht clubs or charity auctions. That was the plan. Disappear from the spotlight, rebuild behind closed doors. But disappearing didn't mean retreating. Her husband had left behind not only assets, but enemies. Some of them had tried to court her, assuming she was weak, an inexperienced widow, overwhelmed by legal jargon and corporate politics. Others had tried to steal, and a few had tried to kill. Margaret had survived them all. Now, she sat in the 50th floor boardroom of a real estate investment firm she had quietly acquired 6 months earlier. The executive team didn't know who controlled the shell company that owned them, only that directives came from a woman named Mar. Every move, every trade, every hostile takeover she orchestrated was precise, timed, and brutal. But this time was different. This time, it was personal. She stood and faced the team. "There's a consortium in London," she said. "They control half the harbor properties in Kowloon. I want the other half, starting with Goldview Holdings." The men around her looked at each other. Goldview Holdings was notoriously aggressive, led by Julian Crane, a corporate raider who had once worked under her husband. He was rumored to have had a hand in Daniel's final business failure. The name left a bitter taste in her mouth. "Goldview's not for sale," said her CFO. Margaret leaned forward. "Everything's for sale. You just have to know what the seller values more than money." That afternoon, she sent her investigator, Lou, to dig into Crane's offshore holdings. Within days, Lou returned with documents, illegal property transactions, bribed officials, and a mistress in Macau with a $3 million condo under a shell company. all carefully buried. She didn't need to go public. She needed leverage. She called Crane personally. "Julian," she said coolly, "let's not pretend you don't remember me." There was a pause on the other end. "Margaret, what a surprise. I thought you'd retired. Let's cut the pleasantries. You own something I want, and I have something you'll want kept quiet. I don't respond to threats. You respond to pressure," she said. "Always have."
Another silence. "I'll have my lawyers call yours." "No need. We'll meet in person." 2 days later, they met in a private room at the Peninsula Hotel. Crane was older, grayer, but still had the same smug arrogance. Margaret wore black, always black, but this time it was power, not grief. "You've built quite a reputation," Crane said, sipping his wine. "I learned from the best," she replied, "including how to ruin someone without leaving fingerprints." "I should have made you an offer back then," he said. "You did. You offered to buy me out of my husband's legacy for pennies after his death." "That wasn't personal." "It was business," she echoed. "So is this." She handed him a thin envelope, photos, financial records, a confidential memo signed by a provincial minister. He didn't even finish looking through it before folding it closed. "What do you want?" he asked. "All the Kowloon waterfront parcels. And your resignation." "You're insane." "No," she said. "I'm just finished pretending I'm not capable of things you can't even imagine." The next morning, Crane's resignation was submitted, his board was reshuffled, and Margaret's real estate firm quietly absorbed his holdings. Victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like inevitability. She returned to her villa in Sai Kung, the sea breeze whispering through the wind chimes her husband once hung. The place was quiet now, peaceful, yet a part of her remained restless. At her desk, she unfolded a letter she had written to herself a year earlier. It was her own post-mortem of sorts, an assessment of what she had become. If you're reading this, you've survived. But have you remembered why you started? Vengeance is a fire, and fire consumes. Do not let it consume what little humanity you still possess. She folded it back and stared at the window. Somewhere, another game was beginning. Another deal, another betrayal. But for now, she allowed herself to rest. Epilogue: A legacy rewritten. Months later, at a foundation gala, she stood on stage accepting an award for her charity's work in Southeast Asia. The applause was thunderous, the crowd oblivious to the blood and ruin that paved her path. A reporter asked, "What drives you?" She smiled for the cameras. "Survival," she said. Then she turned and walked away, her silhouette vanishing into the glow of chandeliers and shadows. Margaret Colburn had buried the widow long ago. Now, only the widow's trade remained.